Tim Linder here. Let's talk about motion blur within After Effects. Motion blur has a lot of steps in order to get it to work and can be a little buried inside of After Effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this airplane in to my composition and I'm going to make it fly across screen. So I'm going to get my move tool here and I am going to set a couple keyframes. I'm going to open this up and change my position keyframe. I want it to start down here at the bottom, and then over the course of not even 1 second, maybe 1 second we're going to take to fly it across the screen. So let's see how that moves through. Now before I preview this, a good idea might be, since I'm only working with this 1 second here in the start of my composition, I may want to zoom in on that one part, so I can grab this top bar here and zoom way in. So I'm really looking tight right here at this one section. I can also again remember to use my mountain little swivel down here to zoom in on that area. And I may even, before I do that, want to grab my work bar and drag it so that when I preview, it's only going to preview this one little bitty area. So I'm just working on this one small area. It's just going to preview that area. If I hit my preview button up here in the top right and I move through, there goes my airplane flying through the sky. So at any given point, if I stop it, I hit the space bar there to stop. If I hit the space bar, it toggles play and pause on the preview menu. It's a quick key combination you can use. So as I move through, you can notice the airplane's not necessarily blurring as if simulating some sort of shutter speed on a camera. If I want that to take place, what I need to do is per layer, I need to turn on motion blur. So every layer has a motion blur toggle that I could turn on and off. And if I turn motion blur on and now I look at this, it's going to be blurry. Sometimes you may turn this on and I may not see motion blur because by default this button up here, which toggles on your ability to actually preview motion blur, might be off. So even if you turn it on right here and I were to render this scene, I would see motion blur, but I may not even be previewing it up in my composition because I don't have this toggled on. So you got to make sure that you have not only this toggled on to preview your motion blur, but it's actually in effect for that particular layer that you want to show motion blur in. And now I have kind of this blurring effect that's happening with my airplane. And the motion's going to look a lot more realistic as I kind of fly through here. So let's say that I want more motion blur than that. I want a lot of motion blur. I want things to look really smooth, really simulate that shutter speed. The way that you go through and do that is you go to Composition, Composition Settings, you use your Advanced tab, and then from there there are the motion blur settings. So at 0 for the shutter speed, I've got no motion blur. If I go up in Composition Settings, go to my Advanced tab, and go more than 180, let's say that I go 280, now I've got more and more motion blur. I can drag this out and really get a lot of motion blur if I want that. Now, as you get a lot of motion blur, especially if you've got rotation, you may start to see some banding, excuse me, or some choppiness within your layer. If you get that, you want to move your samples per frame up a little bit, but you don't want to go much over 20. If you have it really low in the single digits, you may start to see some banding in your motion blur. You want to turn that up. The shutter phase has to do with whether or not the motion blur is primarily on the leading edge or the trailing edge of the motion itself. But that's where you go in to change your motion blur, and I highly recommend this if you're animating typography or really you're animating anything. You'll notice that by default After Effects has it turned off, and that's because it does take a little bit of computational power to render this. So you may not want to do it as you're previewing. You may want to have it off, but when you render, you want to have these toggled on to any of the items, for the most part, that you have motion in. You want to turn on motion blur.